Hi, everybody. This is lecture six, and this one is the Salem witch trials, which are something that the Puritans that we talked about recently are the most well known for, I think. There's plenty of movies and documentaries and all sorts of speculation about what was going on here, but we're here to discuss some of the historical significance of this event. And the reason why I talk about it, I give it its own lecture, is because it is not just interesting, but the Salem witch trials really help us understand why there was a downfall in Puritan society, because this event is kind of the beginning of the end of the Puritans as an entity in North America. They're not taken quite as seriously after this. Their message isn't as well received, and it is become something that their religious organization becomes very tied to in the wake of the Salem witch trials. So it's our job today to try to understand why they happen from a historian's perspective, because historians very much feel that these happenings can be explained by the significant changes that Puritan society was experiencing beginning in the 1680s, even going far back as the 1650s. And it really sets the stage for how their godly society ends up essentially unraveling because of so much anxiety that they have about all of the changes going on in their world. So I'm hoping to use this lecture to really set this up as a society in flux, a society experiencing a great number of changes, and something that is going to be very susceptible to something like witchcraft accusations in an attempt to bring some sort of stability to their world and explain what's going on. So, we're going to start with some boring stuff. I apologize, we're not jumping right into witchcraft, but this is going to help understand why they were so susceptible to witchcraft as an explanation for what's going on, mostly because they are in a very quickly changing world. And one of the things that was changing for the Puritans was their economic system. For a while, because England was not very strong as an empire, all of the colonists in the New World were able to kind of get away with doing whatever they wanted. England was not strong enough to stop them from trading with who they wanted or setting up their own societies. If you remember, England was just kind of happy to get rid of them. They were just happy to have a place to send their surplus population. They weren't really interested in much else besides that. But as time goes on and England gets stronger, they start to pay a little bit more attention to these colonies in North America and think, hey, those could probably make us some money. Everybody else is making money off of their colonies. We, the English, should be doing that too. So as they see that these colonies are now viable, they're more viable than that Roanoke colony, the English start to try to get more control over them, especially to make money off of them, and adopt a economic system known as mercantilism. And mercantilism is a economic system that simply operates under the theory that the only reason for colonies is to enrich the homeworld. Colonies should only exist to make the mother country wealthy and stronger. Colonies should not trade with one another. See, I have this nice graph here. Colonies are not supposed to grow themselves, to trade with one another and act as their own countries. They're only supposed to be places to send people to, and they're only supposed to be places where the people who live there are growing crops to sell to the mother country, or they're selling raw materials to the mother country. And they're just a place to sell stuff to as well. So the colonies are just there to be a market, and they're there to be a place to extract raw materials. They're an extension of the country. They're not their own countries, really. They shouldn't be doing their own thing. They shouldn't be operating under different political systems or kind of growing their own cultures. They're just there to make the mother country rich. And England, by about the 1650s, has decided that this is what it's time to do. It's time to be more mercantilistic and extract wealth from our North American colonies and use them as a place to sell stuff to. So, to that effect, the English government, the English crown, enacts the Navigation Acts. There's a series of them. There's a bunch of different navigation acts, but they all kind of start in about the 1650s. And the whole purpose of the Navigation Act is to forbid North American colonies like Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Jamestown, and whatnot from trading with one another. They are only allowed to trade with England because that's who wants to make the money. They're only allowed to buy from English merchants and trade with English dealers and traders. So anything else is considered smuggling and it's illegal. But that's what they'd been doing. They'd been so used to just doing whatever they want that this is really annoying. We want to trade with one another. We want to do what we want. I don't want to just trade with England. Now I have to, if I want French tea, I have to buy it from an English merchant with a markup. Ridiculous. So they're not happy with the fact that things get a little more expensive now, but also because they are kind of mad that they're being told what to do. No one was around to tell them how to live their lives, and now all of a sudden they've got all these rules. They're not happy. And the Puritans are also simply not happy further. They're even angrier. Because in their minds, this is a deviation from what the country should be doing. England should be focusing on creating a godly society and making everybody pious. This is so commercial. It's all about making money. They were hoping that North America would be a chance to enrich our souls and create that city on a hill. And here we've got everybody just worried about getting rich. That doesn't sound right. So they're extra unhappy. Quiz question number one. What is mercantilism? So the Puritans are not having the best time, and they are also struggling, not just economically, but they're struggling with keeping up the zeal that the first settlers had with religion. Church membership is stagnating. The next generation of Puritans are not quite as pious, not quite as, I don't know, excited, we'll say, about making a godly society. They've grown up here in North America and they're mostly concerned also now with making money. The city on a hill thing is kind of faded a bit. You know, the enthusiasm wanes after a couple years. So with church membership stagnating, the Puritans, especially the big leaders, the elites of the town, church officials, they want to make sure that they don't lose so many members that the church loses power. Because to have power, the church has to have a lot of members. It has to be a good amount of the society being involved. If there's only like 10 people going to the church, nobody's going to care about it. But if everybody is, it becomes a social organization with a lot more power. So the big problem is not just a lack of religious zeal, a lack of religious enthusiasm by the next generation. They're also struggling with the fact that church membership is really hard to get. To become a full member of the Puritan Church in New England, Massachusetts Bay, you have to be considered a very virtuous person by everyone around you. They have to testify to how great you are. And you have to testify that you have experienced a conversion vision, really. Like God has come and spoken to you, and you have accepted his word. They're a little afraid of lying. They're a very virtuous person, very virtuous people. So to experience that, not everybody does, or at least not everybody is willing to say that they did. So it gets hard to get people to be full voting, powerful members of this church. So to combat low numbers and get more people in the church, they make it easier to become a church member. And they make something called the Halfway Covenant in 1662. And what this does is it allows people to become partial members of the church. You could become a member if your parents were a member, or if you were related somehow to a founder. It lowers the bar and it makes it a little bit more accepting to people. You still, to be a full member, you still have to have that conversion experience, but it brings more people in. It's trying to make it more welcoming. It's trying to encourage church membership because church membership is stagnating, and after stagnating, it starts to decline. So this is a The creation of the halfway covenant, they formed it because they want more church members. They want to combat low numbers. They're also forming it because they're just hoping this will encourage participation. They're worried about their society changing. And this is something, this formation of this halfway covenant is really something that historians point to as a real glaring sign that Puritan society was struggling. If you are doing well as a religious organization, you don't need to lower your standards to get people to join. This is considered the Puritans lowering their standards to get more church members. It's a sign that they're not as robust as they once were, not as powerful as they once were. Their society is in trouble and it's changing, and they're worried. So, quiz question number 2. Why was the halfway covenant formed? There's also political changes going on. Um, so we've got economic changes with the mercantilism. Their society is changing because there's less power to the church. There's also political changes that the Puritans are experiencing. In 1675, the English crown, the king, creates an organization called the Lords of the Trade or the Lords of Trade with the sole purpose of enforcing those navigation acts because no one is listening to them. They are smuggling left and right. So we need someone to police that and make sure they are only trading with England, that they are doing what colonies are supposed to do and enrich the homeland, enrich the mother country. But even with the Lords of Trade in place to enforce the Navigation Act, they're still doing it. Nothing is stopping these people. They are doing whatever they want. So in 1686, the English king, King Charles II, decides, I'm going to punish you guys. I'm going to punish you people over there in North America because you keep smuggling, you keep not listening to my navigation acts. So he revokes the Massachusetts Charter, which gave Massachusetts Bay Colony a lot more independence and autonomy. He says, no more. You can't be trusted. You're so bad. You're misbehaving all the time. You're not helping this country get rich. Too bad. So he creates this big mega colony and calls it the Dominion of New England. And understandably so, the Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony area is quite upset to have their autonomy shrunk so drastically as a punishment for having disobeyed the Navigation Acts. They're still upset at being told what to do. They're across the Atlantic. They're kind of chafing under this oversight from Charles II. So Charles II is really determined to keep them in line. And because of that, because he wants them to stop violating the Navigation Acts, he revokes their charter, which means they're more under control of England than they had been. And that's a second reason too. He revokes their charter as a punishment because they're still smuggling, but he's also doing it to consolidate power. I mentioned earlier how England hadn't been strong enough to exert control over these colonies. They'd been footloose and fancy free over there because England just didn't have the strength to do anything otherwise. Now that they are, he's going to flex his muscles. They're going to do this. They want to exert power and control, and by revoking that charter, by diminishing the political independence of this colony, they are consolidating their own power, the English crown. So this is another fear that the Puritans have is this continued political change, none of which is something that they see as furthering their religious agenda of making society more godly. This is all still about money. It's very commercial. They're very unhappy with it. And that whole revocation of the charter is not helping things at all either. Okay, what are we up to? Quiz question number 3. Why did King Charles II revoke the Massachusetts Charter? So I hope we have now set up the perfect storm, really, of a society in New England that is very unstable, very much in flux, and very concerned about what the future holds. Their economic system is changing. They're no longer as strong as they once were socially. They're losing power that way at the church. Church membership is waning. Their independence is being curtailed. There's a lot of changes going on back in England. And of course, they are in a position where they're worried that there's something to blame. They're going to start to look to explain this, and look for a reason why this is happening. You know, they're a very anxious bunch, the Puritans, and this is where they're going to try to start looking for an explanation for all of these changes. It's not something that the Puritans simply invent, blaming witchcraft or blaming people who practice witchcraft for bad things happening. This has a very long history, and they're going to draw on it. These changes inspire them to look to their own cultural past for an explanation to these changes and events that are making the future very unpredictable for them. And something that has a deep history throughout Europe and the world is blaming someone for being a witch, and that's the answer for why things are going wrong. Witchcraft accusations during this era were fairly common. They weren't incredibly common, like they weren't thousands happening every single day, half the population getting killed for this, but they were fairly common. In Europe, between the years 1400 and 1800, around 50,000 people were executed as witches, usually burned at the stake, sometimes hanged, sometimes drowned. But it was something that happened, where if there was something going wrong, or if there was someone acting strangely, there could be an accusation that that person was practicing witchcraft, and the execution of that person was designed to allow people to feel a sense of control, where killing that person was going to solve the problems that the society was experiencing. They were able to have some autonomy, feel like they were doing something, assuage concern in the community, and ostracize and rid themselves of people who were being socially problematic. So there is a history of that happening where something is going wrong, people are anxious and worried, someone gets accused of being a witch and killed for it in an attempt to solve the problem. A lot of times, looking throughout history, there is a correlation between witchcraft accusations and bad weather. Really cold winters, crop failures, there tends to be an increase in accusations and executions for people who were being considered a witch. So you can see where this is going. There's a lot of change going on in Puritan society and a long history in Europe of solving global problems, solving social problems by executing someone who is deemed a possible cause of that. So, quiz question number 4, how common were witchcraft accusations during this era? And going further on this, how this works, how someone is accused of witchcraft, why they would be, is because going a little deeper into this, into the lore here, is it's not just a belief in witches or witchcraft or something supernatural. There's also a belief in something known as maleficium. And maleficium is malevolent or dark or harmful magic that a human being could harness and use to hurt others. And they got that by making a pact with the devil. So there's not just a belief in this abstract concept of witchcraft. There's also a belief that human beings, anybody, if you made a pact with the devil, you could be endowed with certain powers, known as maleficium, that would allow you to do bad things to people around you. So people were very concerned that this was something, a way that the supernatural was coming into their world. They believed in maleficium, the belief that humans could choose to engage with the devil, could choose to do certain things, and that it was very real, where it could have real effects. So it was maleficium that was allowing regular humans to engage in witchcraft. If you were somebody who had this desire, you could make a pact with the devil and be endowed with the ability to make your neighbor's crops fail, or spread disease, or just do something in general that harmed others because you had the desire to do so for whatever reason there was. So there is this suspicion that this is something that anybody could do, and anybody was susceptible to it as well. That there was a way that your enemies could harm you if they so chose. So I like being a little more specific about that because there's this like, okay, what are they thinking about witchcraft? Well, they're not just worried about it abstractly, they're worried about it being applied practically in their everyday life. They're worried about maleficium being used by witches to cause real, tangible harm in society. Being a little more specific about this. All right, quiz question number 5. What is maleficium? So let's move this right along. How does this become a problem? All of this together, the perfect storm of a society, an anxious society in flux, combined with a history of witchcraft accusations. How does this end up getting people killed in witchcraft trials? Well, it starts in the year 1691. And up there in Salem, Massachusetts, there is a family known as the Parrises, sometimes spelled Parish, but Paris tends to be the accepted spelling. And the Parris family is the family of a very respected minister known as Samuel Parris. And Samuel Parris has a daughter named Elizabeth, and she spends a lot of time with her cousin Abigail Williams. The two of them in 1691, Abigail and Elizabeth, began to develop some strange symptoms and experience some strange occurrences. The stories go that Abigail and Elizabeth started to convulse occasionally. They started to shake, to see things. They started to crawl around on all fours and make very strange sounds, um, acting just very, very oddly. And nobody could figure out why the girls were doing this, why their skin was crawling, and why they would scream every now and then, totally unprovoked. There's no explanation that anybody can find for why the girls develop these strange illnesses and why suddenly, after that, other people in town start to experience the same thing. By 1692, according to court records, it comes out that the suspicion of what is causing these strange actions falls on Tituba, who is an enslaved woman from the Caribbean with Native American background. Um, she was in the Paris household, and she is accused of doing witchcraft and causing these issues for the Paris girls and the Paris family and Abigail Williams. Tituba is an interesting figure because she is the first one accused of witchcraft. She is the one that Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris point to when people finally get to try to figure out what's going on with them. They say Tituba has bewitched them. It's the stuff that she is doing that is causing these issues, not just amongst them, but among other children in Salem. And for a really long time, historians kind of assumed that Tituba had been enslaved in the Caribbean and brought to Salem. But there's more and more evidence emerging that she actually was might have been Native American, so she might have actually been an enslaved indigenous woman, or she might have been the product of someone enslaved in the Caribbean and an enslaved indigenous individual, and she was the result. The records are very unclear because the only time Tituba shows up at all in history is her being accused of witchcraft in the 1690s. So it's a very small window of sources for figuring out who Tituba was. But for our purposes, she is significant because she's the one that the Paris household blames for witchcraft. She is the one that they say has bewitched them. And what they say she's done is things that we would kind of see as maybe fortune telling practices or perhaps some non-Christian religious practices that were deemed as either pagan or possibly satanic by the Puritans. We can't be too certain. What we do know is that Tituba was accused of being the one who was causing all of the issues in Salem, specifically among the parishes. Okay, quiz question number 6. Who was Tituba? So it starts out with that. It starts out with these strange illnesses being exhibited by some of the Salem children. When the adults want an explanation, they say that Tituba has bewitched them. She is a witch and she is causing these issues. But how does that spiral out of control? How does it go any further than that? Because it sounds like it should be pretty cut and dry. It sounds like, okay, if they're going to do anything, they would have executed Tituba and everything would have been done. It should have ended with that. But it doesn't. It spirals into a case of what could very readily be called mass hysteria. The way it does that is because when Tituba is accused of being a witch, Tituba does what a lot of other people will do and says, "It wasn't me. I am under the spell of someone else." And Tituba points at other people in town and says, "They have done this to me. There are other witches here. I am simply another victim." And it snowballs from there. Tituba points to two other Salem women that she says are the real culprits here, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, both of whom were kind of outsiders in the Salem community. They were not quite as well respected. They were poorer. They were older women, known to be a little bit less agreeable. So Salem townspeople think that that is a perfectly reasonable explanation. It makes sense that those women would also be practicing witchcraft. So they are brought to trial, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and the trials end up becoming absolute spectacles. When these women are brought in and put on trial saying you are being accused of being a witch, they bring in the victims. They bring in the children that say that, yes, I've also seen them cause issues too. They're just as guilty as Tituba. They're agreeing with her. The victims start to convulse. They start to scream and yell and point at these people and say, "I've seen that woman in my dreams. She has appeared to me in places she should not reasonably appear. She is torturing me. She's poking me with sewing needles in my sleep. She is absolutely guilty." The sight of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne makes the children frantic. So it seems like they've gotten down to the bottom of this. But then the accusations start to spiral from there as well. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne point out other people that they say are witches, and it just keeps going. And it becomes a genuine opportunity for people to extract revenge on community members they don't like. What a perfect opportunity to get rid of your annoying neighbor. Accuse them of being a witch. Maybe they'll be killed, or at least they'll stop bothering you. That's exactly what happens. People get hysterical and they start to see witchcraft in everything as the explanation for everything. And it's a great way to gain a little bit of power. You know, you're jealous of your neighbor. You think maybe he covets your wife, or maybe he has a barking dog that really bothers you and you want to get rid of it. Something like that. A witchcraft accusation is something that has to be brought to trial, and it's spreading in a time when people are looking to exert control and exert power and really bring some stability. But it has the opposite effect. Instead of stabilizing the town by taking this problem into their own hands and enacting justice, it just starts to go all over the place. Eventually, over 150 people in Salem's not that big, are tried for witchcraft. Men, women, children, nobody is safe from being accused of being a witch and dragged to court to stand on trial and try to blame someone else or prove that they're innocent. It's very hard to prove you're not a witch. How do you do that? How do you prove you are not a witch? No, nobody knows. It's very difficult. Blame somebody else. It gets pretty ridiculous at a certain point. There are 4-year-old children being accused of being a witch. It's very difficult to have a real trial when there is a 4-year-old on trial. Another thing making the trials very difficult to draw sense from is that, and something that made the trials very hard to prove you're innocent with too, is that The Salem courts, the Puritans, allowed something known as spectral evidence to be held against the accused. Spectral evidence is non-tangible evidence of guilt. What do I mean by that? Spectral evidence is me accusing someone of being a witch, and my proof, my evidence, is that I saw them in a dream, or they appeared to me as a vision and cursed me. That is acceptable in court, as just as much as a bloody knife would be, as evidence of guilt. It's used against them. People's thoughts, feelings, conceptions, dreams, visions are used as real, solid evidence. It's spectral because nobody can hold it, but it is still considered in the Salem court as hard evidence, as evidence just as good as anything else. This becomes very problematic because spectral evidence is, very hard to dispute. If I'm someone there and on trial and someone is saying, I saw you in a dream, how do I fight that? You can't. It's a very, very difficult process to make sense of. And the spectral evidence does get a lot of people in trouble. There's accusations that certain women would appear in a dream or would appear and seem real in someone's room and that they would do some strange incantation. But at the exact same time, they were seen across town in a tavern. How could they be in two places at once? It must be witchcraft. And that alone, someone saying, you appeared in my room suddenly and you were seen somewhere else, seen in two places, that's evidence. That's spectral evidence that that person is a witch and is guilty. So the use of spectral evidence made it easier for the courts to accuse and convict someone of being a witch. Okay, quiz question number 7. What is spectral evidence? So there are a lot of people because of these reasons, because of the hysteria going on, because of the opportunity it presents to enact revenge against your neighbors, because of the way it's kind of attempting to regain autonomy and stability, and just because you can kind of say anything and it might be accepted in court, a lot of people end up being killed for this. 20 residents of Salem are executed during the Salem witch trials. They are put to death because they have been found guilty of being witches. 19 of them are hanged, which that's a noose. You wrap it around someone's neck, you push a stool out or something out from under them, and they're killed that way. But one Salem resident has the unfortunate, infamous honor, I guess, of having been killed by something called Pien Fortejeur, which means crushing someone with big rocks. And that is Giles Corey, who's pictured here. Giles Corey was an unfortunate Salem resident who was accused of witchcraft and claimed the entire time that he was innocent. He was found guilty regardless and sentenced to death, but because he was a fairly well-respected member of the community, the the court decided that they were going to give him a second chance. If he admitted he was a witch, they would cast aside the death penalty. All he had to do was say he was a witch and he would be set free. He wouldn't be killed. But Giles Corey refused to lie. So they were going to try to extract a confession from him as part of his execution. So Giles Corey was given the Pien Fortadure treatment, which means you are laid down and rocks are placed on your chest. Heavier and heavier rocks, more and more rocks as pictured here, until you are crushed to death and you cannot breathe and you die that way from asphyxiation, you suffocate, or you're just crushed. And as the story goes, apparently Giles Corey was being laid down and being pressed to death. Every time they put a stone on him and said, do you want to confess? Will you tell us you're a witch? Instead of lying and confessing to something he had not done, Giles Corey was reported to have said, more weight, every single time, and was eventually killed. 14 of the Salem victims were women, and the first woman to be executed during the Salem witch trials was a woman named Bridget Bishop in June 1692. We're going to talk about her in just a second, but quiz question number 8. How many Salem residents were executed during the Salem witch trials? Okay, Bridget Bishop. This is an excerpt from the trial of Bridget Bishop in 1692. And this is interesting because it explains a lot about why so many people and so many women were executed for witchcraft. I think it lends sort of a better explanation to why certain people fell victim to this. So this excerpt from Bridget Bishop goes on as following. Why is she in trouble? Why is she on trial in the first place? What brings her suspicions on? A lot of it are as what it says here, that the said bishop did entertain people in her house at unseasonable hours in the night, to keep drinking and playing at shovelboard, whereby discord did arise in other families, and young people were in danger to be corrupted. Hmm. Bridget Bishop was a troublemaker. People didn't like her. Bridget Bishop, throughout her entire trial, is seen by other Salem residents as someone who caused a lot of issues in town. She was widowed several times. She had a couple husbands. She was considered kind of loud and outspoken. She kept a tavern where people played games late into the night, as said here, unseasonable hours. Uh, she was seen as disrupting families. She was seen as a force of instability. She was causing more issues in town. That is something that historians see as the real reason why Bridget Bishop was put on trial. She was a disruptive force to a society that is already worried about instability. To get rid of problems, she is a very easy victim to this. She is a very easy accusation to make. Remember, witches aren't real. People are not being executed and tried because they're actually witches. There's something else going on. This is an unstable society, and the people being executed are those who are seen as causing more trouble. A lot of them are women because remember that great chain of being, that social hierarchy, when you have women like Bridget Bishop causing issues, it's not just breaking up someone's marriage because she was running a tavern and men were going there and leaving their wives. It's also because Bridget Bishop was not falling in line and following that rigid social hierarchy or that patriarchy of Salem the way she should have been. So she's extra disruptive, not just because she's disruptive, but because she is a disruptive woman. So Bridget Bishop is seen as kind of the real explanation for a lot of executions here. Just like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, they're both kind of outsider women, and that is seen as playing a big role in why they were accused of witchcraft in the first place. So they're executed on the, outside here, really ostensibly for witchcraft, but there's something deeper going on. Why they were accused in the first place is because there was already something brewing where they were causing some social upheaval in the town. They were seen as forces that were disturbing the peace, disturbing the tranquility of the Puritan society. So she is seen as her execution is more of something where it's tied with her inability to or choice to not really conform to some social norms in Salem. Okay, quiz question number 9. Why was Bridget Bishop executed? So lots of people are killed in this. About 20 people are executed. Uh, it becomes the news travels that there is a witchcraft epidemic in Salem. Hundreds of people are put in court. There are children being tried. It is getting absolutely ridiculous at a certain point. It becomes so outsized. It becomes so unhinged, really, that the by in 1692, 1693, the Massachusetts governor is forced to step in and say, enough is enough. Stop it. There cannot be 150 witches in Salem. That's enough. The governor steps in and dissolves the entire court of Salem and releases all the prisoners. He says, there is no way there are this many witches in your town. Something is going on here. So the prisoners are released, the court is dissolved. An outside force has to step in and take control over this. Um, a lot of people felt that things were getting quite out of hand, even people in Salem as well. There were plenty of Salem residents that were thinking that this has to stop somehow. Accusations were spiraling, and it's going in the opposite direction. This starts out as an attempt to regain stability and control, now society is falling apart. Salem is crumbling because everyone's being accused of being a witch. Everybody's on trial for being a witch. It's not having that stabilizing effect that it was supposed to have in the first place. So the governor dissolves the court, and another thing that happens is in the aftermath of the Salem witch trials is that a minister known as Increase Mather in 1693, he looks at this and publishes a text known as Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. And in this text, Cases of Conscience, Increase Mather argues something. He argues that this is the perfect example of why people really need to start focusing more on rational, scientific explanations for things that are going on. Because if you don't, this is going to continue to be the outcome. That without science-based, more logic, rational things, it's going to be too easy to spiral out of control and start using things like spectral evidence. Another thing that Increased Mather argues is that you should not be allowed to use spectral evidence. That is wrong. That is very hard to prove innocence for, and it's just not scientific. He was trying to move towards a more rational explanation for things, look for better explanations. Increased Mather also argues in this too that courts should no longer be allowed to take confessions of people threatened with death. If you're being threatened with death, of course you're going to confess to being a witch. That should not be allowed either. Giles Corey very well could have escaped his unfortunate end there, being crushed by rocks, if he'd just said, "Yes, I'm a witch, please stop." And then what would have happened? People would have assumed he really was a witch. But when you're extracting confessions under torture or under duress, it really can't be taken seriously. So Increased Mather argues that the Salem witch trials have shown that some real changes need to occur um, in courts of law, in legal testimony and legal proceedings globally. He thinks that this is really something that needs to change. So he makes those arguments in his text, and the case of the Salem witch trials goes kind of unexplained for a while. There is some thought that it maybe was mass hysteria, that it was just this buildup of fear from political, economic, social change, and possibly even anxiety over attacks from indigenous communities, the threat of war, Spanish pirate. There's a lot of explanations for it. Some people go back to wondering if it may have even been that Elizabeth and Abigail Paris might have had something like epilepsy, or maybe they were being abused by their parents. There's lots of different explanations that have been floated around for what caused this in the first place, what caused the strange symptoms of the children, and what caused this to go as far as it did. There seems like there's a missing puzzle piece here that fear of mercantilism isn't explaining quite as well. So my pet theory here that I like, that I think is the most explanatory for a lot of what's going on, is something that a historian thought of and found evidence of in, I think it was around the 1990s. I could be wrong, but there was a historian kind of investigating this and felt the same way that yes, all of this was exacerbated by social change and things like mercantilism and declining church membership, but the missing piece of the puzzle had to be something else. And this historian discovered that a lot of the things going on in Salem, things like skin crawling sensations, convulsions, visions, sleeping poorly, these were also all symptoms of something known as ergot poisoning. And ergot is a fungus that grows on rye. And it turns out that ergot grows on rye, and it does that really well in very wet years. And it turns out that the Puritans were growing a form of rye that was very susceptible to ergot fungus. And 1691, 1692 were extremely wet agricultural years. So, the explanation that some people have felt is the best one here, is that the Puritans harvested a crop of rye and made bread out of it that was tainted with ergot fungus. And that caused a lot of the strange feelings that people then blamed on witchcraft. It might have caused the tingling sensations, hallucinations, and really exacerbated the whole Salem witchcraft hysteria because everybody was feeling poorly due to this ergot poisoning. I think it was a perfect storm of all of these things coming together. I think it was all of the social upheaval. I think it was the background of witchcraft being a viable explanation for things. And I think it was all mixed in with spectral evidence, personal prejudices amongst one another in town, and ergot poisoning was just topped it right off. And it all came together for the Salem witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, which, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of when the Puritans stopped being taken seriously as a group. It was a society on decline. Their zeal was going down, and this really just ends them. It's very hard to claim to be a godly society looking to create a model culture when this is what happens within that society. Quiz question number 10. What did Increase Mather argue in his text? Specifically, the text here, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. Okay, so that is the end of this lecture. The next one is going to be thematic as well, and it's going to discuss slavery in colonial America.